Okay, well, uh, first of all, hello to fellow Trollopians. And I'm coming to you from sunny California, where it is actually not as hot as it could be. I think our high today is 75. So I'm in Sacramento, California. Anyway, I thought I would approach these chapters, which are uh, rich, rich with plot strands and characters and uh, thoughts about what's correct and what isn't. Anyway, I thought I would approach that by dividing my little talk up into two sections. First, having to do with matters of romance or love affairs, and then secondly, focusing on August Melmotte himself and all the things he's up to. Of course, there's a lot of overlap and interlacing of themes and ideas and characters. So it is a fairly complicated group of chapters. So bear with me. I think I've got most of this. I sometimes get confused when I'm watching British crime shows and can't quite figure out how they came up with the clues as to who might be guilty. So I've done my best to unravel all of the strands here. If I've made a mistake, maybe you can clear that up when we talk about it later. Anyway, to start with affairs of the heart. And I'll start with Marie Melmotte. We already know that Adolphus Longstaff, Dolly, whose match with Marie had been suggested by his family, Lady Pomona, Georgiana, and Sophia. We already know that that's not going anywhere, didn't go anywhere, failed. Dolly was just not interested, and that's old news. Well, let's see, we have Lord Nidderdale. He's the one that I suppose is favored by the family. The idea was, and this is, I think, familiar refrain to us, that Lord Nidderdale should marry money. Of course, that was Felix's idea as well. Lord Nidderdale's first overture was rebuffed, but even though Marie used some pretty harsh language in talking to him, he came away saying, upon my word, she's awfully jolly. So we know that he hasn't really given up on this lady. Felix, of course, is the object of Marie's desire, and they've tried to elope, and the elopement didn't come off. But in thinking about that afterwards, Marie finally relents with respect to Lord Nidderdale and says that I'll marry that other man, Nidderdale, to spite him, Felix. So that not the kind of romantic motivation that we would expect to see, from a lady who's proposing to marry someone. Another couple of very great romantic interest, I suppose, is Georgiana Longstaff and Ezekiel Bregart. And we're introduced to Bregart because he attends Melmotte's party. More about that later. The actual sequence as Trollope presents this stuff in the novel, to me, was a little bit unclear. It was only in a later chapter that I learned that it was at Melmotte's party that Georgiana and Ezekiel Bregart had gotten together. But in any case, in these chapters that we're now talking about, there's some discussion of whether or not Mr. Bregart is a suitable suitor for Georgiana. Well, he's Jewish for one thing, and he's a tradesman, a banker for another. So that all goes against him in terms of what Georgiana's family would prefer, and also in terms of what other parties involved would prefer too. So Georgiana had been staying with the Melmots in London because she felt that that's the only way she could find a spouse. But by doing that, she was, quote, cut by her friends who felt that Melmotte was an unsavory character, or at least a doubtful one. Later, she visited Lady Julia Monogram, just to basically get out, I think, of Melmotte's home and to better her chances for getting out into society. And Lady Monogram promises that she'll have some kind of event or party which would afford some kind of social chance for Georgiana. Georgiana attempts to invite Bregart to the party, but this is rejected very forcefully by Lady Julia, who calls him a vulgar upstart Jew. And all of the language surrounding Bregart by the Longstaffs is extremely strong and extremely negative, reflecting, I suppose we're to think, a general prejudice at the time. Anyway, that doesn't seem to be going too well for Georgiana, and she begins to have reservations about marrying Mr. Bregart, despite the fact that he's rich, he could provide a home, and well, he's not very good looking, but he does have other virtues. Well, that's as far as our chapters this week or these 2 weeks went. So we'll have to see what happens with Bregart in the future. Another couple that we've been interested in is Mrs. Winifred Hurtle and Paul Montague. And we've already been introduced to them, of course. There's a series of meetings between them and a series of letters, some of which are not even sent. Mrs. Hurtle declines to send, I think, some of her bitterest thoughts. But eventually, both parties agree that the engagement is to be broken off. I think Paul obviously thought about that before Mrs. Hurtle. Henrietta Carberry's lovers, Roger Carberry and Paul Montague, I guess that's an ongoing problem or romance, so that Paul ends up at Hedda's home, more or less by accident. Hedda admits her love for Paul in guarded terms, I guess, but she also admits that she has a brotherly love for Roger. Paul then writes to Roger explaining the situation. He had agreed, of course, to steer clear of Henrietta while Roger was still in the picture, but he now feels that his way is open to declare his intentions. Felix told Hedda about Paul's engagement to Mrs. Hurtle, which Hedda could hardly believe. But it was confirmed, at least in part, by Hedda's mother, Lady Carberry. And so Felix eventually confronts Paul himself and doesn't really go anywhere. Felix, of course, or Paul, of course, denies that he's engaged. Felix, I guess in a spirit of reconciliation, says, "I wish to regard you, Paul, as a brother. And if I am rough to you, it is only because you are rough to me." Well, that's one of the most generous statements that I've heard from Sir Felix in this novel. In any case, another triangle involves Felix, John Crumb, and Ruby Ruggles. We won't talk about Felix and Ruby because that's discussed elsewhere. But John Crumb, of course, is the spurned lover of Ruby. And when Felix goes over to talk to Mrs. Hurtle, talk to Mrs. Pipkin, the landlady, where both Ruby and Mrs. Hurtle are staying, Mrs. Hurtle explains to Felix that there may be no engagement. There may be no truth to that engagement between Mrs. Hurtle and Paul. And nonetheless, Crumb shows up later at the landlady's home and vows to confront Felix, saying he'll have it hot someday. Well, we don't quite get there yet to see how hot it's going to get for Felix. But the gist of all of this is that Felix's information about the engagement is more or less debunked by Mrs. Hurtle, more or less. Lady Matilda Carberry and Nicholas Brown have had a relationship from an earlier part of the book. And Brown had reimbursed some money that Felix had more or less gotten from Melmotte, 250 pounds. Brown continues to sympathize with Lady Carberry. They were both at the party. And as Trollope says, they had no thoughts of kissing now, but holding hands shows that the feeling between them had changed. So I think it's changed in the sense of being a platonic relationship or just friends, but we don't know yet how that's going to go. Augustus Melmotte's affairs are basically of two kinds, financial and then political and social. Financial affairs, well, we know that he's a great financier. We don't know details much about his background financially and even his present affairs. But one particular item in his financial dealings has to do with Pickering Park, property owned by the Longstaffs, which he eventually acquires for 80,000 pounds. 80,000 pounds, which, however, he doesn't really pay, preferring to hold off on that payment. He also has the place altered or remodeled to his taste. I think the book says torn down, but anyway, it's altered even before Longstaff, Melmotte really owns it, and it's mortgaged by Melmotte. It's kind of the way he can keep his funds in action. Dolly had, that is to say, Adolphus Longstaff Jr. had written some kind of a memo, a letter agreeing to the sale of Pickering Park, but had not signed the letter and declined to sign it until such time as, well, it was paid for. This letter was filed away and eventually, well, I don't think we can talk about Melmotte's activity in this regard, but eventually Melmotte forges Dolly's signature on the letter. And Dolly engages an attorney, a Mr. Squarcum, to look into the matter for him. Dolly feels that the attorneys for his family, Slow and Biddlewhile, which we've met in other novels of Trollope. Anyway, he feels that they're just a little bit, well, too slow, and that they're not quite active enough on his behalf. So he engages Squarcum, much to his father's dismay. And Squarcum succeeds in pressuring Melmotte to ameliorate the situation. But that's coming up. This is all in the future. Melmotte is, of course, involved with the great South Central Pacific and Mexican Railway, the shares of which fluctuate. Of course, we've never heard of any construction on the railway. There's been no documentation of anything. I think Paul Montague was hoping to find out something about that himself, but so far there's very little to be said for the actual railway being surveyed, planned, and so forth. So the share values of the railway fluctuate, and they fluctuate mostly lower, especially just before the election. This all causes Melmotte's star to fall somewhat in the financial world of London. I should mention too that Felix had invested £1,000 in the railway, finally got repaid 600 of that in railway scrip. And I think it didn't quite compute to him that wasn't the same as cash. I guess scrip in this case meant, well, like shares. Anyway, the other aspect of Melmotte's activity was the political and social aspect of it. Besides being a financier, he also wanted to be a great man of society, a great British citizen. So one way he got this, he attempted to get this accomplished was to host a dinner for the Chinese emperor. Tremendous, huge affair in which members of the government, leading members of the financial world, even artists were invited to this huge dinner. But unfortunately, by the time the dinner happened, Melmotte's reputation was beginning to tank. And a lot of people had doubts about whether they ought to be seen at such an affair. And so it wasn't that well attended. Melmotte had even provided, foreseen that something might happen. A private escape route, had modified the building so that people like the Chinese emperor and maybe the prince could leave unnoticed. When a lot of the conservative politicians and other guests didn't show up, Melmotte went so far as to think, well, maybe he should have stood for the liberals, not the conservatives. So such was his commitment to his party, I suppose. But anyway, it was at this party that Mr. Brown and Lady Carberry also attended, although we don't hear a lot about them doing that. Marie and Hedda, though, also attended, and Hedda discussed, they both discussed Felix. Marie was still concerned. She still was in love with Felix, and she was hoping that Hedda could encourage her in maintaining her feelings, but Hedda wasn't much encouragement. However, Hedda did agree to speak to Felix and to convey to Felix that Marie was still deeply in love with him. Just saw a note here from somebody about scrip and it being, I think, newly created shares. New or old, I suppose, are equally worthless in this case. But anyway, I suppose Felix was happy to get something. Nidderdale and Marie also got to talk about their relationship at this party. It's a pretty important affair. Marie was not enthusiastic about Nidderdale, finds him to be dull and certainly not as handsome as Felix. So, uh, so their relationship is just put on ice, I guess you'd have to say. It still exists. The next day after the party, Melmotte found that his closest associates, the Grendels, Lord Alfred and Miles Grendel, really didn't want to have anything more to do with him. They suspected the worst. And thinking about them immediately afterwards, Melmotte called them aloud, well, almost aloud, curs. So he was very disappointed in the abandonment of him by his friends. There was an election then the next day. It seems like a lot is happening here in a short period of time. But anyway, the election for the House of Commons for the member for Westminster is held. Melmotte is in the race against Ferdinand Alf. Alf was the editor of the newspaper, the Evening Pulpit, that was critical of him. The Evening Pulpit had publicized rumors about the possible Pickering fraud. But anyway, Melmotte won. In a close election, he won. And reflecting on his successes, even if he were to be eventually caught for any misdoings, Melmotte thought, well, I am a self-made man who began without a shilling, without a friend, almost without an education. So lifting oneself up by one's bootstraps, I guess you could say, a matter of some pride. Why did Melmotte win the election? Well, Trollope suggests that it's because the electors, particularly the common folk, have a love for rich persons who spend a lot. He also thought that there was some sympathy for people who were perceived to have been subjected to ill usage, harsh criticism, kind of the in America what we call the favoring the underdog, and then also for some sympathy for crimes against the wealthy. So kind of a Robin Hood idea. Well, in any case, Melmotte does get into Parliament. We don't get to see his most infamous appearance there, but we do get to hear about his first speech. He makes an impromptu and awkward speech, not really knowing, the traditions as to how you're supposed to go about that, but not bad for somebody who's just newly elected to Parliament to get up there and express himself. But afterwards, Melmotte concluded, it seems to me to be a stupid sort of place. So he wasn't as impressed as perhaps he thought he should be. Just a few reflections that I wanted to offer afterwards, after this little talk. First of all, to quote Henry James, which was quoted in the Oxford Reader's Companion, also I think in Francis O'Gorman's preface, a more copious record of disagreeable matters could scarcely be imagined than the way we live now. And it is copious. There is a lot going on there. There are a lot of characters, and there are a lot of strands of action here and there that interweave, but they are mostly disagreeable, or at least they're not awfully uplifting. My own little conclusion is the trend of events seems to be ever downward. Even the bear garden is closed, at least for now. The novel becomes ever more complex. Its plots increasingly fraught and entangled. The dark and dubious personal relationships, even the fragile positive ones, as well as the financial affairs, are clouded in uncertainties, threats, and discouragement on the part of all characters, major and minor. Now, there might be some exceptions to that generalization. Can this lead to anything but tragedy on multiple levels? The final chapter in today's selection, Sir Felix Meddles in Many Matters, is no more hopeful than the preceding 69 chapters, despite some prosaic but redeeming qualities evident principally in the characters of Roger Carberry, Henrietta Carberry, and perhaps Mrs. Pipkin. Hard to think of Mrs. Pipkin as a strong character here, but anyway, but as we know is always true with Trollope, no one is entirely imperfect or without saving grace. And gratefully, we have the author's elegant and engaging prose to draw us onwards and perhaps upwards as well. And finally, as a postscript, I wanted to offer a few visual images. These are engravings that accompanied the novel when it was first published in parts and later in the first two book editions. The engravings are not by Trollope's favorite illustrator, John Everett Millais, but instead by a person named Lionel Grimston Fawkes. Here we see, this is Mr. Melmotte, and he is, oh, yes, here he is speculating, I guess is the idea. And here we have Squarecum in his office. I thought this picture was somewhat autobiographical. It kind of looks like me at this at this little talk. But anyway, another photo, let's see, can we go to, there he is in Parliament. He's got his hat on. I think people are recommending that he take his hat off, and he's not quite sure what to do, but he speaks forcefully enough. And then, oh, finally, and I wish it bit, I wish it were evening here now in California. I could have a glass of wine or even champagne, but this is not a bottle of champagne in the house. And so the bear garden is falling on hard times at this point. And I think that concludes my visual and verbal attempt to deal with what for me was some pretty complicated stuff. Anyway, I hope you had something out of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Secretary. Thank you, Lee.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.